Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. In this episode of Reinventing Parking, I'm speaking with Carlos Felipe Pardo, who is Executive Director of the non-profit organization Despacio in Bogota, Colombia. I also had him on my other podcast, Reinventing Transport, to talk about the idea of slowness in urban transport. But Carlos also knows parking issues from his wide-ranging experience as a trainer and consultant on urban transport issues in cities across Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Carlos has an MSc in Contemporary Urbanism from the London School of Economics, and he was awarded the Danish Cycling Embassy's 2018 Leadership Award. I hope you'll enjoy the discussion as much as I did. So, Carlos Felipe Pardo, welcome to the Reinventing Parking podcast.
Thank you very much. This is great to be here in this very nerdy topic.
Yes, we've got parking nerds are our main listeners. So today we're going to talk about Colombia's cities and some of the interesting parking policy conundrums and trends in Colombia's city. I should mention that I was in Colombia about a year ago, and you and I worked together. We visited several cities and we ran some trainings and we investigated the parking situation in those cities. And so this conversation builds on what we learnt together in that process. Those cities were Bogota a little bit, but also Ibagué and Pereira, cities in the coffee region. Several things surprised me about parking in Colombia. Most of my experience with parking has been in countries like Indonesia, China, India, where motorists are more than willing to park in the street, and the on-street parking is generally less well managed than is ideal, to say the least. And so motorists will park too much in the street, illegally, on the footpath, everywhere, and it's difficult to persuade them to park in the off-street parking, which often exists, but has a cost, has a price. And so we have this very common problem. In Colombia, it was different. And this came as a surprise. And I have a sort of working theory, and perhaps you can tell me if I'm correct or not. But my working theory on that is that there's sort of two reasons. One is that there is off-street parking. There's a sort of fairly vibrant industry of off-street parking, partly because the cities have been liberal in allowing buildings to not provide parking if they pay into a parking compensation fund. So this creates the demand for off-street parking. The other reason there's demand for off-street parking is what I mentioned, that Colombian motorists, at least in the past, were willing to park off-street, much more so than in the regions I've worked in. And my theory on that was that it's because of the security situation in the past was bad, and so motorists, out of concern about their vehicle, would want to park off-street. Does that sound plausible, that whole scenario? And does that match with how you perceive the situation?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. There may be a little bit of more history to these things. There is one issue that I've noted in Colombian cities in particular, especially when compared to other cities in Latin America, which is where I've worked the most. And it's that we've had a lot of buildings with underground parking. You won't have overground, you won't have another lot of parking. So that's one very specific thing that I've found that is not so common, at least in Latin America.
So that's important because perhaps underground parking is extremely expensive and therefore requiring too much of it would seem unreasonable. So perhaps the parking requirements are not extreme in that case. Is that what you're getting at there?
Yeah. So there is, of course, the what we see in every city that doesn't understand parking. There are horrible requirements for parking. They're badly set. They're really enforced. Every person in development, or any developer, is sort of afraid of not building the parking lot with even more than what is required by law. So that is sort of part of that trend. But I think that that is sort of a part of the issue of people saying, well, we park off street. We're not parking on street. Like you go to Mexico and then you see that people are just parking everywhere. But there's other things that I think are useful to understand this. One is the very, very sinister issue of security that you've already raised. But then you have to link that also maybe to the fact that we had a lot of car bombs in the 90s in Colombian cities. So you would have cars that you would think, well, that's just a car, but then it would just all of a sudden explode and then just kill everybody around it. And we
Wow.
had a lot of that courtesy of Escobar, now this famous, I guess, TV star after dying. But the thing is that this kind of thing is what people are basically afraid of. I mean, it has even happened to me on a bicycle. Like I've sometimes left the bicycle parked on the street, and then everybody's like, "What is this bicycle doing there? Maybe it has a bomb inside." But the one last thing that I think is useful to understand this, that I at one point wrote about this in your blog of Reinventing Parking about the Bogota history, the first
Hmm.
part out of three, and I haven't written the third part yet. But so what happened in the first Peñalosa mandate is that he actually encouraged strongly the private sector to build off street, to get off street parking, to
Ah,
basically, he said, I shouldn't be in charge of your socks where you put them. I shouldn't be in charge of where you put your car. So just have the private sector solve that.
right. And these were public parking, even though it was private
Exactly.
sector, but private sector building public parking. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So then he basically told anybody who would have an idea of having any sort of business, he told them, well, just get a parking lot for everybody because I won't be giving them parking on the street. So that sort of generated this idea of parking on the street is bad, not just for security reasons, it's just bad, period, because you don't have public space. So then cars should be off the street.
Mm.
And I think sort of the combination of those factors makes it very much of a norm of everybody saying, well, we just go and look for a parking lot where I'll pay. And
Right.
yeah, that could sort of give a little bit more of history to it.
And then fast forwarding to the situation now, and part of the reason that people in the three cities were asking for help on parking is that there's a sense that there's a crisis of on street parking getting out of control now. And I guess some of the reasons for that might be that, first of all, car ownership and motorcycle ownership have been going up over the last 10 years as the Colombian economy's been doing quite well. But also, secondly, with the security situation and the car bombing situation no longer so scary, people are more willing to park in the street than they used to be. And so Colombia's on street parking dynamics and the interactions with the off street parking are becoming more normal, more like other countries.
Right. And then if you look at 2006, for example, that was the main change in motorization in the country. That's when you saw that people were really starting to buy cars. And then when you look at around 2010, you start seeing this in motorbikes. So it's exactly what you're saying. That we used to have enough space, let's say, for the cars that were there to just park off the street in the parking lots. But now we're starting to see that people are just, everybody's buying a car and they're just looking for spaces to park anywhere.
Mm.
And yeah, so I think motorization is a big thing that has changed the scenario and made people sort of start thinking about this. There's one thing I've never really known as a fact because it was something that my father, who just doesn't know too much or at all about transport, was telling me once. He told me that in the 60s, we had actual parking meters on the streets of Bogota, which to me sounds extremely weird because I had never heard of anybody talk about this. But I guess that before the 90s and even before the 80s, we must have had a lot of cars just parking anywhere on the street. And then this sort of, I've never really started to look at when it was that they started to go off street.
Uh-huh. I had the same experience in Bangkok when I visited Bangkok and was looking into the parking there, and I was at the relevant agency, and they took me into a back room and showed me what these ancient parking meters that used to be in the streets of Bangkok. So yeah, I guess this is a common story.
Yeah, probably. I would like to see ours, yeah, but I've yet to see.
So we have this existing sort of almost like a tradition that many motorists are accustomed to paying for off-street parking wherever they go, more or less, or at least in many places where they go. And so now cities are increasingly starting to say, okay, let's start to manage our on-street parking better. Let's start to introduce fees. Some of them have had fees for a while, but many cities haven't, and they're just introducing them. I know Bogota last year when we were there was talking about introducing them. I don't know if it has happened yet, and the other two cities were at different stages of getting there. But it's an interesting phenomenon that even if people are willing, have been used to paying for off-street parking, suddenly it seems to be a different story when suddenly they're asked to pay for on-street parking. Am I getting that wrong?
Right. I mean, the typical thing in transport that when mostly motorists are used to something free or being paid by somebody else, essentially, then when it starts being more explicit that they are the ones who have to pay, then they get angry. Now that I start to think more about this, we used to have one thing which was called the blue zone, which you saw in Pereira when you were there last year. And it's essentially a very manual, not to say archaic, but a very basic system where somebody charges you and just punches holes in a ticket and then just puts it in your windshield and it says, well, you basically paid. Now technology makes it much easier. No, we all know that parking is something which charging and defining the price has all these different technologies to make it work. But the blue zones in the 80s and even 90s, actually, when they were in place, they were just stopped because it was fully manual, so fully possible for the attendants to just find tricks to
Ah,
actually get all the revenue for themselves.
I see. So this sounds very similar. This sounds very similar to, say, in India, where on-street parking fees have got a very bad name because of the non-transparent and, frankly, sometimes even criminal involvement in the on-street parking collection. So yeah, I guess that would be another reason why people would be wary of the reintroduction of on-street parking fees if they feel it's going to be like that.
But the user is fine. Like they know that they're going to pay less. They're happy
Uh-huh.
because they get their car basically it's minded by somebody.
I see.
And just the city is sort of saying, well, we're spending all this money to not get anything, just even not even get our costs back. So it
Right.
sort of generated that bad image. But Medellin has something in certain neighborhoods which is called the ZER. It's the regulated parking zone, and it's attendants who charge you, but then they have this little machine where it's much more difficult for them
Right.
to apply the trick that the other guys were applying. So then it starts to work.
They have digital handhelds. I understand. That's right. Okay,
Exactly.
interesting. So, is there any particular Colombian city that you could name that seems to be a leader in terms of improving its on-street parking management?
Other than the Medellin regulated parking zones, I can't. City councils are very strong in these kinds of things.
Mm.
They can basically veto any of these policies. The city council in our cities in Colombia is extremely strong when it comes to charging things, when it comes to generating new charges or taxes, basically. And there is this specific regulation that indicates that council is the only body that is able to approve or not approve or basically veto any new tax. And that's exactly what it says, any new tax.
Okay.
But for whichever reason, everybody in every government in Colombia is afraid of them, even if it's not a tax, but a charge, even if it's a modification of the charge. So we've had cities try, like Bogota has tried everything.
Mm.
They've tried congestion charging 3 times. They've tried liberating the parking price per minute in the off street, which is actually capped for the past 10 years or so.
Ah, that's a whole other issue we should talk about. Yes.
Huge. Yeah, they've even tried to do more recently, like a month ago, they presented to council a plan to charge for something that is now called the surcharge, the parking surcharge, which is allowed by national government
Uh-huh.
within the development plan for cities to implement. And what they can do is that they can charge twice as much for parking, and then this factor of one, let's say that the remaining amount additional to what is being charged originally, it goes straight to government so that they can subsidize public transport.
Okay.
So it's a pretty good idea, not necessarily the best way to implement it, because of course the private sector, the operators will say, well, what do I get out of this? But this was also stalled by council, and they said, well, we don't want this because we don't have for public transport, we don't have good public transport quality. And everybody was saying, like, it's exactly the point. This is the way that you fund better public transport for everybody.
Okay, that's really fascinating, isn't it? Because many cities around the world would dream of having such powers to levy various fees and taxes. Uh, Colombian cities have that, but of course, the politics is not always easy to do such things, and it's very easy to raise suspicions. There's even a fuel levy, isn't there? Bogota has its own fuel levy.
Now we have a wonderful surcharge that is 25% on top of the what would be the price. And this is used, half of it is used for mixed traffic roads. The other half is specifically for mass transit infrastructure.
Could be.
And yeah, that has funded most of it.
This issue of price controls, because that was a really interesting topic that came up. There's only a few countries around the world where governments, either local governments or higher level governments, regulate the prices of off-street private sector parking. And Colombia is one of those places, and not all of the cities are doing it, but some cities do. So Bogota does, and I think Ibagué does, but Pereira didn't. So I gather it varies around the
Mm-hmm.
country. But that was a fascinating issue because it seemed to change the mindset and the politics of parking in those places that had that, because once government is controlling the price of something, then everything changes. It becomes a highly political issue. Whereas in Pereira, parking prices were not a political issue. In Bogota and Ibagué, they were.
It's textbook transport economics, no?
Right.
I mean, I guess it's sort of, after saying hello, they explain to you this exact phenomenon, and they say don't do it. So this is not something to do, but then they anyway do it, and it's really sad. And it's horrible that this cap has been going on for beyond a decade. Like, it hasn't even been adjusted for inflation or for anything. It's just been exactly the same for more than a decade. And I really side with operators on this. Of course, everybody in every sector says that they're not earning money, but they actually, I don't know how they've been doing this in order to keep on having a business, because their prices have not changed at all for this very long period of time. And everything else has increased. Transmilenio fare has increased, the land value has increased, like everything has increased, but then they still have this cap, and it's a fully political thing. Council says, yes, we don't agree to increasing parking prices because that sort of, it goes into the pockets of these very rich people. And yeah, so it's really sad.
So I guess maybe one opportunity to reform it might be to implement this parking surcharge or tax at the moment that gets implemented, then at the very same time deregulate the prices. So it might be a matter of timing, so that they can then say, okay, we're making those rich people richer, but we're going to tax away some of that at the same time, as a political way to get beyond this problem. Because it's very interesting. I see this in India. India hasn't had price controls on off-street parking, but several states are starting to do that now, partly based on court rulings and litigation by well-meaning consumer rights advocates who think that there's some unfairness here. But it's a real problem, and I can see how it's going to creep in, and gradually India is going to be in this situation that Bogota and other Colombian cities are in. And once you have these price controls politically, it's hard to get rid of them, isn't it?
Yeah, and then there's this whole issue of what you just said, fairness. What is fair to whom, and why should you try and control something which will not really generate any fairness to anybody? Like it doesn't really generate equity. It doesn't really think about the poor and all the arguments in favor of saying, well, yeah, there are some poor people who are going by car because they need to go by car and then they don't have anywhere to park and they will be out of their jobs or it will be very expensive. It's sort of this very minor population, but there is no real argument behind this. They tend to equate public transport fares to parking prices. And they say, well, no, I mean, you have to be very careful about this because it is something that people are going to pay. But it's a completely different animal, public transport and parking. It's sort of actually the opposite animal almost.
The commercial parking industry in many countries and cities is very difficult to understand because there's often so much else going on besides parking. A lot of the owners of these car parks are using them as land banks sometimes. So they're not actually making a profit on parking, but they're waiting perhaps for the next real estate boom or to get permission to build a big building or whatever. And parking is just a sort of you know, a marker.
Yeah, and Bogota had once this small initiative that lasted very little time. It was a decree that indicated that any land that would not be economically active for a good purpose would be taken and from the owner, and then they would build social housing. So it was a very thoroughly developed law decree in Bogota,
Okay.
and they actually got to scare a lot of people who had like 100 parking lots. And then they said, "Look, what am I going to do? I've been paying all my taxes, so how are you taking this from me?"
Uh-huh.
And this was exactly to avoid what you just said, having people with 100 parking lots, which will eventually become this huge piece of real estate that they were just sitting on and they were just waiting for the right moment. But that decree, of course, was killed after a short while. Of course, I don't have to tell you this, but parking is in the middle of all these problems for cities. And then if we don't address them properly, then it's going to be a problem, I guess.
Just to finish up our conversation, let's talk about something that's relevant to the more outer parts of Colombian cities rather than the central core areas, and that's in areas where there is new commercial development along main streets and main roads. Very often the main format for the parking is in the frontage of the building, just in front of the building. They may well have underground parking, big buildings, but small buildings that have been converted into shops. Very often the parking is just in front of the shop, and it very often is in an ambiguous position in whether it is on the private property or in public space. It straddles the sidewalk, the footpath very often. And this is very similar to what happens in India, in Vietnam, China, Indonesia, and I'm sure it happens all over the world, Africa, Latin America. So it's a very, very common problem in the sort of the new growing areas of cities all over the world. We need a solution. Carlos, do you have a solution for frontage parking in Colombia?
That I've been struggling with that question myself. I I think that this basically is from the assumption that people will not shop unless they have the opportunity to arrive by car directly at the exact place where they're going to shop.
Hmm.
Let's think about Guarulhos in Brazil.
Ah,
We were doing a training course once in 2006, July, and then we were walking around Guarulhos, and then we saw that there was this one place, and this is a typical picture that many of us have in different places of the world. The car can actually go all the way into the shop, basically, and it's actually taking space away from the products. Like they could have more products there,
hmm.
but they have preferred to give space for one car of one person that may come rather than give more space for what they're selling.
Ah.
And then this was sort of this very clear indication that it was extremely important for them to have parking because they would otherwise not have it. And they just decided that it should go into the shop.
I wonder if it might even have been the shopkeeper themselves wanted to park, but
Yeah, no, it is perfectly clear that it was them who took the design decision, let's say. But then, so what they did in the first Peñalosa term in 98 was that they looked more specifically at who was parking in order to arrive at these shops along Carrera 15, this very specific road.
hmm.
They were going to take parking from the entire road. I mean, it was this from 70 seconds. So it was like more or less 3 kilometers or 2 miles, more or less, of this avenue. And they said, well, we have to demonstrate that this is really not something useful for them. When they did a survey looking at who was arriving by car, it was more than 80% either the shopkeeper or the shop owner.
Aha.
And then they told him and said, well, you are the ones who want to park here. It's not a question of you having more or less customers. It's just you thinking that you need to park. And then they just took all the parking out because they said, well, your argument is useless. More or less 10% of people will need this, and they can actually park a little bit further back or further away or into the another street. And this was something very specific.
That's a reminder that these surveys of how people arrive and where they park and whether they come by car or motorcycle at all is a very useful tool in parking change and parking advocacy.
Right. And then the other example is actually from today. We are in Bucaramanga now doing a project here. The project is on cycling, but we, as part of the project, we are working with UN Habitat. Well, they said, let's try to do something, one of these tactical urbanisms or pocket park, or basically take space away from a road or a street or a parking lot or a parking space. And then we found one place where we said, well, it's really, really sensible to reduce the width of the street to improve the crossing. And we could also take away 2 or 3 parking spaces that we found that were actually not allowed to park, but everybody was parking there. So we said, this is going to be a hassle. Like, everybody's going to be against us. It's going to be really bad. But when we arrived at the neighbors sort of association, they told us, we have been asking for exactly that for the past 2 years. So what took you so long?
Hmm.
And then we were really happy that we were actually proposing something that we thought was going to be hell to describe and to present and to get their approval. And they were basically saying, this is what we wanted all along. So then I think there are these small opportunities where you can see that people are actually positive about it, and hopefully we can get more of this in future.
Yeah. And getting back to that issue of frontage parking, even in the interests of the shopkeepers, it would probably be better if instead of them for their very tiny shop having just 1 or 2 private parking spaces, which is incredibly limited, if they could either do away with those and have parking in the street that is public parking, because the curb cut that allows people to get into the frontage means you can't have on-street parking anyway, or continue to have the frontage parking but have all of those very, very small frontage parking spaces somehow managed in a collective way, either through a neighborhood association, a business association, or perhaps they can form an agreement with the city to have their frontage parking managed as part of the public parking for the area. So that, for example, a restaurant's parking will be full at meal times, but empty other times. And, different kinds of businesses have different peak times for their parking, and it would be beneficial for them if they could benefit from the pool of parking in the sort of walkable neighborhood, making use of their neighbors' parking. But it's a cooperation problem. We need some sort of mechanism, and I haven't heard of successful projects along these lines yet. But I keep plugging the idea. But if you hear of an example of anywhere doing that in a successful way, that would be great.
Right, and I think that parking is a not sexy topic, and it's a very nerdy topic, and that's what maybe makes people say, okay, it's boring, just put more parking, and just build a multi-level story parking, because they don't really get into it and don't say, well, it's really wonderful. you can do so many things with parking. And if we could find the best way to demonstrate this to both people who are living in cities and the private sector and government, to find out that if they think about it a little bit more and just do this small effort, they will get a lot. It's like vitamins, or like these things that you have to take when you're a child and you don't want to take them because they taste ugly. You have to take it and you have to understand that this is important. Don't be a child, learn parking.
Bitter medicine may not be the best analogy. We need to sweeten the deal somehow, and yeah,
but,
let's look for
but
ways
it
to
is
make
important.
this a sweet deal. But
Can be, yeah.
In future episodes, we're going to have various Shoupistas. Hopefully, one day we'll even have Donald Shoup himself on the program. But
A rock star.
yes, who's managed to make parking interesting for people. So thanks very much, Carlos. It's been very interesting discussing our experiences and observations of Colombia parking, and I hope it's been relevant to people outside of Colombia. A lot of these issues are universal. Each place has its own unique twist, but it works differently everywhere, and we can learn from each other. So thanks again, Carlos.
Yeah, thanks.
You've
for
been
the good
listening to
talk.
the
It's always nice
Reinventing
to talk
Parking
about
podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.